So our featured speaker this evening, Sir Lawrence Freedman, I will introduce after we have dined. But always at the beginning of this event, I like to say a few words about why we're having it. As you know, this is the Jack Ruina Nuclear Age dinner. Jack Ruina was the founder of SSP. Harvey Sapolsky was the second director of SSP, and I am the third director of SSP. One of you may be the fourth director of SSP. And I may anoint you soon. It could be coming, right? And Jack was not only the founder of SSP, he's the professor emeritus of electrical engineering at MIT. I'll just say a few words about Jack's background. Just so you know, when Jack retired, he had some funds, and somewhere buried at MIT there were some funds, and Jack said, "I'd like to do something with these funds." And I said, "So would I," right? and it occurred to me that this was when this occurred, it was at a kind of I won't say a nadir, but the whole profession was doing less nuclear work for a brief time, and Jack's main interest for much of his the latter part of his career was in strategic nuclear weapons and strategic nuclear arms control. So I suggested to him, what about sponsoring a speaker once a year to come talk to us about nuclear issues? Jack's happy. Anne-Marie Michael in the dean's office, who raises funds, she's happy. So I'm happy. So this is the, in fact, origin of this dinner is that Jack created some endowment to support it. Now, Jack was an undergraduate at the City College of New York, which is a legendary place for high-powered and contentious intellects. He did his graduate work at the Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn, where he got a master's in electrical engineering and a doctorate in electrical engineering. He was at one time voted an Outstanding Alumnus Award from both colleges. He taught at Brown University and the University of Illinois. At the University of Illinois, he headed the radar division of the Control Systems Laboratory. While on leave from the University of Illinois, he served in several senior positions in DoD, the last being the director of DARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. He was honored with something called the Fleming Award for being one of the 10 outstanding young men in government in 1962, which is quite a long time ago now. He served on many government committees, including a presidential appointment to the General Advisory Committee, and acted as senior consultant to the White House Office of Science and Technology in the late 70s. He also held the post of president of the Institute of Defense Analysis. And then at MIT, he was vice president for special laboratories and was for a long time secretary of the MIT faculty. In his office, he had years and years of minutes of these meetings that he had taken. I have no idea what happens to those meetings because I go to them sometime and I fall asleep. So governance at MIT eludes me. It happens somehow. But Jack was extremely active in it, and we should be thankful that he was because someone has to have run the place. And Jack was very active at MITRE and was on their board of trustees, and has been an honorary member of the board since his own retirement, and he was the first director of SSP. And so I always like it in these meetings for us to keep good thought for Jack. He lives in Washington now with his children. But this seed that he planted or replanted at SSP has borne a lot of fruit, and many of you here are working on nuclear issues. We have drawn some support from foundations that have come back into the nuclear realm, and we're looking forward, we hope, to making a senior hire in nuclear issues. And we're extremely pleased, and I won't go into it now, but I'll introduce our speaker later. Our speaker devoted much of his career to studying nuclear weapons issues, and I've known him almost since the beginning of my career, so I'll tell us a couple of stupid stories after dinner. But for now, I encourage you to enjoy your dinner, and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. It's my great pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker, Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, who's been a professor of war studies at King's College London since 1982, and vice principal there since 2003. He was educated at Whitley Bay Grammar School and the universities of Manchester, York, and Oxford. Before joining King's, he held research appointments at Nuffield College, Oxford, IISS, where I believe we first met, and the Royal Institute of International Affairs. He was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1995 and awarded the CBE Commander of the British Empire in 1996, appointed official historian of the Falklands Campaign in 1997, which produced a 2-volume work. He was awarded the KCMG, I get to learn all these things tonight, KCMG Knight Commander of St. Michael and St. George in 2003, and was appointed in June 2009 to serve as a member of the official inquiry into Britain and the 2003 Iraq War. People often say he's written more things than I can count, but actually I went to count them, and I won't get into this, but I had a sinking feeling because it ran to 25-odd pages. Since 1988, there's nearly a dozen books, the most recent of which is A Choice of Enemies, America Confronts the Middle East, which was a prize-winning work and won several awards and got great reviews. One of the reasons he's here this evening is since the beginning of his career and when we first met, he's been very interested in nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear weapons and British nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear strategy, British nuclear strategy, deterrence, foreign policy, defense policy. These are the areas where he has done his work and where he's made such great contributions. I was I believe a Thomas Watson Fellow fresh out of my college years in 1975, and I think that's when you were at ISS, and where we met in a building that the ISS deserted 2 or 3 buildings ago at 18 Adams Street, a building so old that when the surveyors came to figure out what to do to renovate it after they sold it, and I asked them, what holds this building up? They said sky hooks, which is a special British invention that they use to keep these old buildings up. I think Laurie and I were present for one of the great culinary events in England, which was the opening of the first several McDonald's, and I believe we enjoyed many sumptuous repasts, and I believe even Steve Van Ever was present for one of those. For those who want to know what a great improvement McDonald's made, I can commend the scene in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy where the protagonists are having breakfast at Wimpy's, and you will notice what a great improvement that is. Finally, Laurie shared an anecdote with me. Jack Ruina, who was the sponsor of this event and its namesake, was one of the people that Laurie invited to England, I think, some years ago when you were a junior faculty member. You had a little travel budget to bring in guests, and you brought Jack over, and I think you were astonished to find out that Jack had burned up your entire travel budget. Yes, and those of us who know Jack know that he was basically tight with our dollars, but not with everyone else's, and and this is a chance for us to reciprocate, and we're really pleased that we could do it. So we're really pleased that you could be here with us today, and you're going to talk a little bit about the nuclear taboos. So thank you for coming. Sir Lawrence Freedman.
Barry, thanks very much. I remember those days long ago when we both had hair. It's overrated, yeah. Yeah, that's right. Use your hormones as you feel fit. As Barry said, I met Jack in the early 70s in the circumstances he described, and if it wasn't for my old supervisor, whose 90th birthday we celebrated the other day, Sir Michael Howard, bailing me out, the Oxford University Strategic Studies group would have been stillborn. All our funds would have gone. But let me start there, because I invited Jack to give a talk there. I can't actually remember how I got the opportunity to invite him. Maybe he was in London for some pugwash thing or something. But I do know why I was keen to meet him, because he was a member of that remarkable and influential group of American scientists and engineers, many of whom, not Jack, but many of them had come of age during the Manhattan Project, who were committed to both national and international security. They accepted that the United States had to be abreast of all the most advanced weapons technology, but also that these must not be pursued regardless of the consequences. Knowledge allowed for informed choice, and these choices had both ethical and prudential aspects. A new system should not be built just because, as Robert Oppenheimer remarked of Teller's solution to the H-bomb, it was technically sweet. But you had to ask, was this a weapon that really added strategic value? How would the Soviet Union respond? Would the result be a situation that was more or less stable? If the prospect was instability, then might it not be better to search for a cooperative rather than a competitive solution, arms control rather than an arms race? My admiration for this group was a direct consequence of the way I'd been introduced into the core issues of nuclear strategy and arms control in the late 60s and early 70s. Because then, for those of you who were around in the debates at that time, may recall that the issues were largely framed for the lay audience through a series of technically proficient and elegantly illustrated essays in the journal Scientific American, written by some of the greats of the American science community, a number of them, like Jerry Wiesner, very much associated with MIT, Hans Bethe, Herbert York, George Rathjens, and so on. And these combine great authority with analytical clarity and a strong policy message in favor of arms control. And I think the importance of these essays is now forgotten, but for a while this is how you got your information about weapon systems. There was nothing else as good. There was that and aviation, weak and space technology, but that was more gossipy. And so this was a really important source. And the big issue with which they were working at the time, these essays were focused on, was really that of ballistic missile defense. That was the big issue on which a lot of the propositions that set the framework, framed the issues of nuclear arms control, strategic arms control, came around this, because it was developing a very counterintuitive view of the issue. It would seem that if the American people were vulnerable to a ballistic missile-delivered nuclear attack, was there not a deep moral responsibility, at least to try to mount a serious defense? As President Reagan put it in the 1980s, it must be better to protect the American people rather than avenge them. And it was a persistent thought that never went away, as Reagan's own intervention demonstrated. But the problem with the thought that was not its moral inspiration, but its technical practicality. The arms control scientists demonstrated that the consequence of the attempt was likely not to be an improved defense, but an enhanced offense. This was how the pages of Scientific American were used. Slowly but surely, during the 1980s, the secrets of MIRVing, multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicles, became known. And it was through Scientific American. That's how people find out about these things. The offense not only then had the advantages of being able to decide when, where, and what to attack, but it now would be able to overwhelm the defense with multiple warheads, including decoys. And this turned ballistic missile defense into a snare and a delusion, a stimulus to an arms race rather than a source of safety. And at least temporarily, these arguments won. In the spring of 1972, Presidents Brezhnev and Nixon signed the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Now, Jack Ruina was quite important in this story. He's an MIT professor combining political science and electrical engineering. He was one of the first to develop this argument. Whilst he was at the Pentagon in the early 60s, he wrote a paper with a small group that argued that an ABM would be destabilizing. The idea didn't take hold, and Jack left the Pentagon. Then in 1964, he wrote a paper with Murray Gell-Mann for a Pugwash conference in India, which produced, and Gell-Mann has written about this, that this produced a totally incredulous Soviet reaction. They accepted the logic, but they wouldn't accept the politics. How could a government explain to its people that they were abandoning attempts to defend them? And that same year, Jerry Wiesner and Herbert York made similar points in their article, National Security and the Nuclear Test Ban, published in Scientific American. The logic won. The Soviets accepted the political argument as well, and eventually came to use it back against the Americans. Now, in fact, Wiesner had put these arguments as early as 1960 in an earlier Pugwash conference. In fact, I think it must have been the third in the series, just before he became President Kennedy's science advisor. This is one of the few fora where American and Soviet scientists could make contact. And we know from Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s account that the arguments then of the Americans somewhat bewildered their Soviet counterparts. They hadn't grasped, in sort of the slightly condescending way Schlesinger described it, the higher calculus of deterrence as now understood in the United States. And given that the incoming Kennedy administration was basing its policies on erroneous expectations of a missile gap, and that the centerpiece was to be a massive increases in American missile production, it's easy in retrospect to mock the judgment. Nonetheless, these counterintuitive propositions, some of which Wiesner produced in 1960, ended up setting the terms for the nuclear debates of subsequent decades. Defense was bad and offense good. To avoid perceptions of first strikes, threat to cities were to be preferred to threats to offensive weapons. The actual numbers of weapons was largely irrelevant, so long as they could survive a first strike and still assure the destruction of the enemy. These became core propositions, but they're not intuitive. They had to be argued for, and this group made the arguments. Now, entering all of this debate in the early 70s, I remember the importance, if one had to have any credibility, of demonstrating some grasp of these technicalities. If now political scientists have to know maths, then they have to know a bit of physics. So a true nuclear specialist had to be able to understand the properties of the weapons. It wasn't enough to talk about warhead numbers and megatonnage, but one must also understand the hardness of targets expressed as pounds per square inch, and missile accuracy expressed as circular error probable, to distinguish between point and area defenses and alternative types of radars. The policy debate required this sort of an unusual degree of analytical sophistication, which became even more important as arms control became more demanding and the verifiability of systems became as important as their explosive yield. How many people remember FRODs, functionally relevant observable differences? See, once you learn it, you never forget it. The idea that the nuclear debate had to be between analysts was reinforced when one of the main proponents of an ABM system, Albert Wohlstetter, took one of the main opponents, notably George Rathjens of this department, to the curious court of the Operations Research Society of America for analytical misdeeds in mispresenting the arguments against effectively Wohlstetter, which is a total kangaroo court, which of course worked in Wohlstetter's favour. At the time, these were seen as completely misguided and vindictive, but they have a certain poignancy in retrospect, for we now know that President Nixon had very little interest or confidence in the somewhat contrived analysis being developed in favour of the safeguard ABM system. He basically did see it as a bargaining chip with the Soviets. So the idea that strategic arms policy really could turn on projections of Soviet warhead numbers and capabilities, factored against particular vulnerabilities of American systems, couched in quite fanciful scenarios, reflected perhaps less a chasm in the American debate, but just how much was being taken for granted, especially with regard to its overall political context. It had become very technical, which became a sort of displacement activity for the politics. So by the early 1980s, in practice, it was actually really quite a mature field. The basic arguments had been developed, and I have to say, just as I was beginning my graduate studies when all these strategic arms limitation talks were being successful and sanity appeared to have burst out in terms of the debates that had been set during the 1960s, I did wonder whether I'd made the right choice, and thought maybe I should go into urban planning or something like that. I made this point in the early 1980s when it had all gone haywire, and a guy came up to me and said, actually, I'm in urban planning. And I was thinking... anyway, but it wasn't... I mean, the point is, it was a mature field because the areas of difference had become so narrow. And much of what we now know and think about nuclear weapons, strategy and arms control was already in place. Just to give you some examples of the extraordinary continuity in the way we think about this topic. The bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki still provide us with most of what we know about the human effects of nuclear detonations. And a lot of what we further know came from the atmospheric testing of the 1950s. The 1958 book, The Effects of Nuclear Weapons, is still a pretty standard text. Stuff on nuclear winter and so on was added later, but the actual raw data comes from that period. Soon after Hiroshima, deterrence was recognized as the most appropriate strategic role for nuclear weapons. It indicated a defensive intent and a preference for the status quo against any attempt at radical change. During the 1950s, deterrence was extended to allies to provide them with security. By the time the doubts had grown as to whether there were any circumstances in which nuclear weapons might be used first, the Americans had already offered security guarantees to NATO, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and so on. And these remain in place and continue to complicate all calculations of nuclear strategy. By the mid-1950s, the disarmament issue had come to be seen to be too difficult. Abolition would require too many moving parts to be in harmony and to a shared purpose. The disarmament process would take decades, not only to negotiate, but to actually achieve if the weapons were to be decommissioned safely and verifiably. Hence, the stress from the mid-1950s moved to the more modest measures of arms control when the term was first used in its modern context, in preference to disarmament. All the key concepts of arms control were developed in a series of landmark books of the early 1960s. Steve and I were just talking about one famous one edited by Don Brennan. The work of Hedley Bull and Tom Schelling and Mort Halperin all comes from this period. And soon the arguments were first agreements in place, notably the Partial Test Ban Treaty of '63, and preparations were being made for the series of strategic arms talks, which continue to this day. This decade, the 60s, concluded with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which still provides the main focal point for efforts to control the spread of nuclear weapons, although it's now been supplemented by other subsidiary arrangements and agreements. The main delivery systems were in place by the early 60s. The current arsenals, long-range bombers, ICBMs, SLBMs, are largely derivative of those developed in the 1950s. The B-52 first entered series service in 1955. A refurbished and refitted version may well still be in service by the middle of this century. Cruise missiles, you can argue, was an addition of the 1970s, except the first cruise missile was the V-1. The Russians had always had cruise missiles. The Americans had them. I think there was one test which went so far wrong it hit the Amazon rather than where it was supposed to hit. They were abandoned, but then they came back again. So my point is that what nuclear weapons can do, the means available to use them, we knew largely then, and we haven't really taken this much further. We don't think we can get rid of them easily, and certainly not quickly, but we have, in the process, therefore, learned to live with them and avoid somehow, against what many people thought was the odds, managed to avoid the annihilation of our whole civilization. And what I want to do in this lecture is to ask whether this continuity of the past sets the pattern for the future. And to do so, I want to consider three propositions, by no means mutually exclusive, that might be used to explain the past stability with a view to considering how well they might work in the future. And these are called prudence, taboo, and scripts. I put taboo in the title because that word is the one most used to describe the tradition of non-use. Schelling, who did popularize the term, says he prefers talking about the tradition of non-use, and I tend to try to follow Schelling in most things. But the word taboo is being used. And actually, it's the script idea, which I think is probably most original in this. I want to develop a bit more. Now, the period that I've just described, from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, has been described as the golden age of nuclear strategy, and the intellectual legacy of that period, I've argued, remains profound. It was actually Wohlstetter that introduced to a wider public the issue of first and second strikes in his famous Delicate Balance of Terror article in Foreign Affairs in 1958. But he was working themes that he and others had been developing at RAND for quite a few years. and this provided the basic organising framework for the policy debates. And at issue in all of this was whether the system tended to instability or stability. The logic, as it turned out, tended, thankfully, towards stability. And this was expressed most vividly as mutual assured destruction, a term which conveyed exactly what it was supposed to convey. Destruction would be assured and mutual. It had, unfortunately, the acronym MAD, which critics used to describe a deliberate policy choice, a mad policy choice. It was not, however, a strategy, but rather the statement of a condition which precluded strategy as previously understood in terms of the ability to achieve a decisive victory. The presumption was that the inescapable risk of a catastrophe would restrain political leaders. The scenarios which Wohlstetter was promoting in the ABM debate by the early 70s combined analysis of technical possibilities that might persuade an adversary to take risks, but with often very crude political judgments about the adversary's risk-taking propensities. There was an example in his 1958 article of the assumption that because the Soviet Union had lost 20 million people in the last World War, they could contemplate the loss of similar number in the next, because it obviously shown that that was a sort of number they found tolerable, so long as they could claim some ideological victory at the end. Jack Ruina, in fact, tried with a colleague, Howard Margolis, quite unsuccessfully to get this alternative view described as nuclear utilization theory, or NUTS. It's an article worth reading still. But MAD survived, NUTS didn't. Experience and common sense argued that political leaders would be extremely reluctant to accept any risk of nuclear war. And this view came to be articulated most clearly by McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor to Kennedy and Johnson. They argued that the balance of terror was extraordinarily stable because the cost of a single nuclear weapon detonated over a major city, never mind the hundreds that could come raining down in the nuclear exchanges planned in advance by military establishment, such a single weapon would be a catastrophe beyond human imagination. He observed the, in quotes, enormous gulf between what political leaders really think about nuclear weapons and what is assumed in complex calculations of relative advantage in simulated strategic warfare. Deterrence, he argued, didn't use the term till later, was existential. Even when the Americans might have had something approaching a first strike capability in the early 1960s and looked at it quite seriously with Carl Kazin, who we were talking about earlier, even when they looked at it, the uncertainties were still too great to act upon. A decade later, by the early 70s, it was clearly gone. There's a telling moment in a National Security Council discussion early in the Nixon administration in 1969 about ABMs, which indicates how much those who might have liked a meaningful nuclear advantage recognized that it was not to be. In the discussion, Nixon observed that, quotes, "Suppose you could defend cities, really means credible threat of first strike would be much greater if they are screwing with allies." That's Nixon language. Pentagon officials explained that this would still not be available even with ABMs. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff opined, "If I thought technically, fiscally feasible to develop ABM defense, which would give first strike capability, I would advocate it, destabilizing or not. Wouldn't bother me." To which Nixon responds, "Wouldn't bother me either," but then added, with his typical elegance, "Nuclear umbrella in NATO is a lot of crap. Don't have it." So thanks. Yeah, very Churchillian, and very reassuring to us Europeans. I mean, the latest, those who haven't looked at them, the latest, the Fruce volumes on Nixon's strategic weapons policy and arms control are just wonderful because they're full of transcripts of this sort, very vivid. Anyway, keep in mind, this NATO nuclear umbrella is a lot of crap. Keep in mind that it was the demands of extended deterrence, of the need to provide a nuclear guarantee to allies, that was the main argument of those opposed to reliance on MAD, which suggested a stalemate which wouldn't allow you to use nuclear weapons first. Unless the Americans were in principle prepared to use nuclear weapons first, then how could a conventional attack on Europe be deterred? A few years later, beleaguered by those who thought that there was a real advantage to be thought, an exasperated Henry Kissinger explained at a Moscow news conference. People forget where these things were delivered. One of the questions which we have to ask ourselves as a country is, what in the name of God is strategic superiority? I'm not going to try the accent. What is the significance of it? Politically, militarily, operationally, at these levels of numbers, what do you do with it? So whether nuclear superiority would matter would depend on there being a crisis of such proportions that one side or the other might still be scrambling for some sort of meaningful advantage. At this point, any favourable possibility might be seized upon in desperation to bring matters to a successful conclusion. And this was quite an important distinction between what was called arms race stability and crisis stability. Schelling, for example, imagined a mutual fear of surprise attack, creating almost panic conditions in the minds of political leaders and turning into a self-fulfilling prophecy. He thinks I might, therefore he might, therefore I think he might, and so on until eventually I will. In practice, however, the arguments for restraint always looked more compelling. The growing acceptance of existential deterrence reduced the inclination to solve the problems of the nuclear age through new technologies. The limits of the options became apparent during the Reagan administration, which considered in quick order strengthening offensive systems, moving to strategic defences, and then radical disarmament. And each time it all seemed a bit far-fetched. Concern about new weapons developments and various potential asymmetries had already come to be phrased not in terms of their actual impact, but their impact on the perceptions of others, which is really the last refuge of the scoundrel in these sorts of debates. So the mechanism for taking seriously contingencies that might otherwise be recognised as being quite preposterous was dependent upon a patronising attitude towards both allies and adversaries who had to be assumed to be unable to grasp the underlying reality of nuclear relationships. Brent Scowcroft, who performed many services to his country, in 1983 was asked to find a survivable way to base ICBMs, and he concluded quite quickly that there was no way out of the problem as framed, but once it was framed in a different way, then it really didn't matter at all. And hence the end of some quite absurd basing modes proposed for MX, of which fratricide was the most absurd. Dense pack. Remember dense pack? Used to describe the minds of those who thought it up. Actually, it was just impossible to explain. To going to a congressional committee to explain dense pack was the last straw. I think that's what led to Scowcroft's commission. Anyway, all this provides the first, to me, simplest, most persuasive explanation for the avoidance of nuclear war. It's a matter of common sense and prudence. If fighting for big existential stakes, then the weapons might be used, and that would be catastrophic. If the stakes were not existential, then why even think about using nuclear weapons? In this way, the nuclear issue brought to any consideration of major war a unique clarity. Political leaders, for that reason more than any other, I think, haven't been tempted by any possibility of a successful nuclear offensive. Now, there are alternative explanations around, and one of the other explanations is that not only would nuclear use be irrational, it would also attract an unbearable social stigma. And this is the so-called nuclear taboo. The existence of a taboo was first identified by the Eisenhower administration, using the term, in the mid-1950s as an obstacle to what they considered to be the sensible, tactical development of nuclear munitions. The administration expected that over time these weapons would be viewed in the same light as conventional weapons, but instead the opposite happened. They came to be seen as exceptional weapons, so pernicious in their application that no moral person could contemplate their use. Nina Tannewald, who's done the most to examine this issue, argues that the taboo takes restraint beyond deterrence. There may be no fear of retaliation, but nuclear use still seems to be unthinkable. It's a difficult proposition to prove because there aren't many circumstances and we haven't got any clear examples. Nonetheless, she's pushing the idea of the taboo in a sociological sense, as a social prohibition, something that prevents you doing something that might otherwise be a bit tempting. I'm not actually, it's a phrase that I've used quite a bit myself, but the more I've looked at it, the more I'm not sure how helpful the idea of the nuclear taboo is. A lot of social taboos, say incest or polygamy, affect defined social groupings and may therefore be ignored by those in different societies with their own distinctive value systems, even when the norms are strong and are policed to a degree, so long as those are abandoning the taboos, are consenting when they do it, then the prohibition may have little effect. Over a period of about 4 decades, the prohibition on homosexuality was successfully subverted as an increasing number of individuals felt that it went completely against their nature and acted ever more openly as if it did not exist. We can think of other taboos, mixed marriages, that now seem to belong to an earlier age, although there may still be some communities where they still affect behavior. So the function of a taboo is to sustain a social status quo. Like deterrence, they have a very conservative role to discourage radical challenges to the status quo. For that reason, they can seem to be reactionary and untenable. Subverting them can be seen to be a brave and noble act, say, for example, in the civil rights movement. Social taboos, therefore, can be honoured not so much in abstinence, but in hidden practice, and may erode completely over time. So what was once hidden becomes open. Moreover, the nuclear situation is very different from these sorts of situations where taboos may be effective instruments of social conformity. There might be something that we can describe as an international society, but it's not going to be as close or intimate as a national community, let alone a small town. Tannewald places considerable weight on anti-nuclear movements as a source of the taboo, as a source of the stigma. But I'm really not sure about this. To the extent that these movements prospered, it was because they were playing on a general unease. But that unease was around before the movement. It can be sensed in a lot of the initial commentary post-Hiroshima, or in Truman's worry at the time of Korea, that it must not seem as if the Americans were reserving these weapons solely for Asians. The Lucky Dragon incident of 1954, when a Japanese fishing boat was caught by fallout from a thermonuclear test, provided more evidence of the especially pernicious effects of these weapons. The Eisenhower administration felt that the Eisenhower administration disagreed with this taboo, tried to argue against it, in part because they felt that implicit threats to the Chinese that they might be prepared to use nuclear weapons, where it was a factor in getting the ceasefire in Korea. And so they were disappointed and frustrated about these weapons not being seen as just more efficient munitions, but as occupying a quite distinct category of awfulness. However, this was largely in connection not with so-called strategic nuclear weapons, but with tactical weapons, not the new thermonuclear city busters. Eisenhower knew perfectly well that these were not weapons that could be used easily, and that gave him some confidence in deterrence. The big shift was in recognizing that the dread of nuclear war was really holding back adversaries as well as your own side. The message behind anti-nuclear protests that these weapons were awful, on which Tannewald relies, was not controversial. The debate was with the political programs of these movements, especially when they suggested unilateral disarmament. Here, by contrast, they were considered to be naive, and they didn't influence Western governments, nor really, in general, except for odd moments, public opinion. These movements assumed that politicians could not be trusted to respect the taboo and had to be deprived of any means of using nuclear weapons in any circumstances through full abolition. And the social analogy breaks down when one considers the rise and fall of taboos. There might be some norms that are breached covertly at the international level, for example, on assassination or cyber interference. But it's hard to imagine how a nuclear attack could be covert or be progressively broken by a pattern of increasingly overt behaviour. The use of nuclear weapons could never be a private affair. Tannewell notes that a nuclear taboo could remain in place even after a weapon has been used against real targets, and that must be correct if the analogy is being followed. And we might assume that the international reaction will be one of shock and horror and a determination to reinforce a prohibition. But this would be an exceptional event that, even if limited in scope and effect, would nonetheless have a transformative impact. We would be in new territory. The circumstances in which social taboos are broken may be generally deplored, but they're still well understood. The point about nuclear use is that it would be such an extreme act, carrying such intense risks, that it would be recognised as an extraordinary leap into the unknown. It may be that there is a social prohibition on nuclear use that is separable from a basic prudence, but because it's never been put to the test, it really is impossible to test. Now, we can call this tradition of non-use the result of a taboo, and we must assume that the first to break this tradition will be acting in an alarming and reprehensible way and be described as such. Without playing down the importance then of the strength of the non-use norm, I want to suggest yet another factor in addition to common prudence that helps explain the tradition. This factor I'd put as the lack of a script for the use of nuclear weapons. Now, the idea of a script, which is important in contemporary psychology, is an expectation of how a familiar situation is likely to unfold. They provide initial guidance on how to behave. So the standard example is entering a restaurant when a certain sequence of events is expected: reservation check, taken to table, showed menu, poured water, etc. Any deviation from the script, being kept standing, not being given a menu, starts to create a sort of panic. But it's noticed and alerts the brain to some distinctive features of the new situation, which now must be accommodated and addressed. Now, war has scripts. People go into wars thinking they're likely to follow a particular pattern. Of course, the problem is that other people have got their own script, and that's the challenge of strategy. A lot of strategic debate is about which script to work on. For example, the debates about manoeuvre versus attrition or how to manage insurgencies. They all assume patterns of behaviour, sequences of behaviour that are likely to unfold. And the wily military strategist might try to upset what they expect to be the enemy's script by imposing one of their own and then catching the enemy unawares. And these scripts can be influenced by prudential restraints and social conventions. For example, those in play at the start of the Second World War, which argued against the use of chemical weapons or city bombing. Now, one of these restraints held chemical weapons, partly because of ignorance on both sides about what the other had, and a concern that what the other had would be worse than what they had, and therefore it was wise not to get it started. But city bombing, of course, all the restraints were eroded over time. And that was why the atomic bombing of Japan became conceivable. The progressive brutalization of warfare, attacks on the British population, followed by attacks of even greater ferocity against German cities, the V1, V2 weapons, the systematic firebombing of Japanese cities, and then the atom bombs. The rationalizations that accompanied this brutalization assumed that there'd be a real effect on the enemy's war effort. Hiroshima was described as an important Japanese military base. It was assumed to have strategic effect, but that assumption depended on what had gone before. It wasn't something out of the blue. Now, we know there's a debate still on whether it actually had any effect on the Japanese decision to surrender. I believe that it did. And actually, if it did, it was to the extent that to the Japanese, this was a completely new development that was separate from the script that they thought that they understood. They were left shocked, disoriented in the face of a new situation that they couldn't grasp and to which therefore they could not respond sensibly. And from the American side, to the extent that the atomic bombing did follow a strategic script, this was exactly what was intended. The debates about dropping the bomb talked about a shock effect, something that would be quite different from the effects of other types of bombing. This helps explain the problems the Eisenhower administration faced when they tried to find a way to use nuclear weapons as if they were conventional. It was very unlikely to lead to conventional conclusions. Once attempts were made to imagine their use in a real war, the scripts all pointed to disaster. Millions of West Germans supposedly being defended would have been wiped out, and that assumes that only NATO would have used the weapons before the Warsaw Pact came in. My favorite was always the Davy Crockett, which was the weapon that had a lethal radius greater than its range. So the most powerful metaphor of the script that was developed during the 1950s was that of escalation, drawn from the concept of the moving staircase that takes you up to the next stage without an opportunity to turn back. The scripts of escalation described how even a war conceived as being limited could turn into an utter tragedy, and the evidence of the exercises seemed to bear this out. Now, in the 1960s, there was a counterattack against this tragic view of escalation, and attempts to develop an alternative script based on control. The most notorious example of this was Herman Kahn's taxonomy of the numerous different ways. I think out of the 44 stages in the escalation ladder, all but 15 involved nuclear weapons. As you went up the ladder, it all, with being able to sort of decide how you moved up and down at each stage, it all ended in what he described, apparently unaware of the Freudian implications, as a wargasm. But Kahn's attempt to script a general war between the two great Cold War alliances lacked plausibility and had no substance in any actual experience. During the seminal crises of the early 60s, Kennedy and Khrushchev could have made moves that would have forced a confrontation, but they held back. Tom Schelling and colleagues organized crisis games at the time for the White House, from which came the large and basic lesson that it was very hard to get policymakers, when barely role-playing and with a pressing, urgent contingency in mind, to start a nuclear war. They were horrified by the prospect and could not see how they could emerge from such a conflict with a sensible outcome. This is the origins of Bundy's existential deterrence. It was called the crystal ball effect. Political leaders had the advantage of what their counterparts in the first part of the 20th century lacked, a clear forecast of the utter destruction that would mark a nuclear war's final conclusion. One way by which strategic debate was conducted after this was by ignoring the problem of scenarios. Conflict analysis neglected the awkward question of how a conflict had ever got to this point, or else were found to be at the limits of plausibility. This included the one where we came in, which involved the Russians attacking all American ICBMs in a high-risk attack with little margin of error, killing millions of Americans in the process, on the assumption that an American president who could not muster an exact response in kind, though he could retaliate viciously against Soviet cities, would be left dumbfounded and cowed into surrender. The only scenarios in which nuclear use might make sense would either be the original one, against a non-nuclear country with no reliable ally. It was possible to imagine arguments for attacking such a country on the verge of acquiring a nuclear arsenal of its own, but before it reached an operational capability, that is preventive war. Patently illegal under the UN Charter and morally reprehensible, it was considered by the Americans in the early 50s, against the Soviet Union and against China in the early 60s, as well as by the Soviet Union against China in the late 60s. Once there was any chance of retaliation, however small, it was hard to explain why rational leaders would resort to nuclear war. So to start a nuclear war, if you look at the scripts that were used, required a heavy dose of irrationality. The scripts involved evil leaders without moral sensibility or with a totalitarian sensibility that would willingly sacrifice millions of individuals in pursuit of some historic destiny. For example, the speculation that Mao, with so many Chinese to spare, would have entered a war sure that on numerical grounds he would have eventual victory. Another possibility was Hitler in his bunker, or Saddam or Kim Jong-un in their own desperate gambles to survive, or Israel determined to bring its enemies down with it, think Masada or Samson. In order to add credibility to Western theories of deterrence that could never explain how Article 5 obligations to allies might be met in conditions of mutual assured destruction, circumstances conducive to irrationality were posited: rising casualties, extreme events in prospect, a deep sense of a progressive loss of control as allies were overrun and conventional army shatters. They depended on passion. They depended on emotion taking over from rationality. Now, it was one thing to imagine how this essential irrationality might happen once conventional battles were underway, but much harder with a cold start at times of crisis, for example, as suggested by Schelling, in circumstances in which both sides had reason to fear that the other might preempt. During the Cold War, Berlin was always seen as a likely flashpoint for a war, tanks at Checkpoint Charlie. But exactly why an incident should rapidly and inexorably escalate to an all-out war required filling in a large number of steps when political leaders might still be expected to think and communicate sensibly. A variation of this was the fear of an internal loss of control. This could lead to accusations, possibly believed, that an adversary was subverting the state. Think North Korea or Libya last year, but with a nuclear arsenal. Actually 2011, thinking about it. Civil war or insurrection could lead to major troop movements which might be deemed threatening to neighbouring states. Again, while a number of the steps along the way were missing, demonstrating why such turbulence should lead to deliberate nuclear use, this was the sort of scenario that was seen as potentially coming into dangerous play in Eastern Europe in the late stages, terminal stages of the Cold War. Think John Hackett's book on the Third World War, which used this sort of scenario. As a result of, or else we can think of the idea of internal disorder resulting in nuclear facilities becoming vulnerable to a group plotting a coup, feared during the French general's revolt in '58, or some faction, think Pakistan, in the event of an attempted Islamist takeover, or current worries about the Syrian chemical arsenal. In scenarios of unauthorized use, a rogue commander takes it upon himself to attack a hated enemy. This might come for nationalist, secessionist, or ideological reasons, or just as part of a power play in an unstable situation. Now, as a result of all of this, considerable effort was put into guarding against such eventualities through fail-safe mechanisms, dual keys, and such like. Unauthorized, or even worse, accidental use remains one of the standard nightmare scenarios, with Armageddon the result of some ghastly technical malfunction rather than deliberate intent. Consider movies such as Failsafe and War Game, which assume pre-programmed scripts with the appropriate prompts leading to war without human intervention, and therefore impossible to interrupt, like Khan's Doomsday Machine. And many of the horror stories during the Cold War involved early warning systems picking up phantom attacks, such as flocks of geese being interpreted as incoming missiles. I think there are good reasons for suggesting that when it comes to the major powers, scenarios for nuclear use remain very hard to construct, and over the passage of time, increasingly hard to imagine. And that should be a source of some comfort. We are now far away from the days when air raids causing massive casualties were almost routine and certainly expected from any belligerent. The presumption now is that conventional weapons can be used with great accuracy, so there's no excuse to target cities. Indeed, it's hard to identify targets other than the most deep and hardened command bunkers that can uniquely be destroyed only by nuclear weapons. And even there are some that's moving along. There are therefore even fewer scenarios in which nuclear weapons can be used to strategic effect. If major power war can be avoided, then so should nuclear war, at least involving major powers. But there are two important cautions to this conclusion. The first is that one reason why it was hard to develop credible scenarios during the Cold War was because stability was not just the result of a nuclear balance of terror, but also because soon into the Cold War, the political structure of Europe became congealed. And once Berlin was sorted, the dynamic for war was hard to ascertain, which is why the focus came to be on intra-bloc rather than inter-bloc instability. In more fluid situations, with important shifts taking place in underlying power balances, think Asia-Pacific at the moment and the spat between China and Japan, then it may be different. It might also be argued that during the Cold War, Washington and Moscow developed their conventions of crisis management, supplemented by devices such as the hotline, that allowed for continual communication and a degree of learning about the character and the behavior of the other side. Without this experience, even apparent rational policymakers might still miscalculate. The second and probably even greater caution rests with the diffusion of nuclear capacity from the great powers to minor powers, from large to small, in some cases embryonic arsenals, from the managed antagonism of the Cold War to complex regional settings, which do raise challenges to nuclear non-use. Proliferation has moved beyond the suspects of previous decades, Israel, India, and Pakistan, to include North Korea and possibly Iran. South Africa abandoned its nuclear program, while Iraq had its abandoned for it. Other countries in East Asia and the Middle East are believed to be considering their nuclear options. During the Cold War, even conflicts within regional subsystems were contained to some extent because the superpowers were intent on keeping the lid on anything which might escalate into a wider war. Post-Cold War, there now is more fluidity, possibly resulting in complexity and confusion. Can we imagine existential threats emerging out of these situations that would generate the intensity of emotions and insecurity that might just lead to a nuclear authorization? You can add to this, I won't go into it, the idea of a terrorist bomb. It's become more prominent in the literature, and certainly there's evidence of non-state actors that don't necessarily have the wherewithal, but certainly have the interest in such capabilities. Now, the most likely scenarios for nuclear war still seem to me to arise out of a substantial conventional war, especially if one side found itself staring into an early and complete defeat. Here, think India and Pakistan. These two countries have managed 3 wars. The last of these involved the fracture of Pakistan into 2, with one part becoming Bangladesh. The original casus belli, the status of Kashmir, remains unresolved, and with alleged Pakistani support for anti-Indian terrorism, has come close to prompting further wars. In some respects, they also pose an existential threat to each other. Pakistan defines itself through Islam, while India has defined itself through secularism and multinationality. India detonated a peaceful nuclear device in 1974. Pakistan immediately vowed to acquire a nuclear capability of its own. In 1998, both tested real nuclear weapons. The next year, there was fighting between the two over the Kargil district of Kashmir, caused by Pakistani paramilitaries infiltrating into the Indian-controlled territory. There was a further crisis in 2002 following a terrorist attack on the Indian parliament, which India believed to have been sponsored by Pakistan. It was only after intensive American and British mediation that the standoff was concluded and the two sides withdrew. If you want to know why the State Department and the Foreign Office didn't pay enough attention to what their governments, the rest of their governments were plotting over Iraq, just remember that that's what the Foreign Secretary and the Secretary of State was doing for the first half of 2002, dealing with India and Pakistan. It was a further terrorist attack in Mumbai in 2008, evidently sponsored by elements within the Pakistan government, led to a further increase in tensions. There have been occasional attempts at rapprochement, but direct communication between the two governments are infrequent. There's no symmetry between the two. India is much larger in territory and capabilities. It's shown its much stronger economic growth, stronger conventional forces. But Pakistan is believed to have larger nuclear forces, which is seen as a vital compensation for its conventional inferiority. With or without nuclear weapons, this doesn't appear to be naturally a very stable relationship. And it makes it a critical test of those who argue the ability of nuclear weapons to impose stability where it is otherwise absent. Those who argue, like our good friend Ken Waltz, that proliferation need not be a cause of anxiety because they make countries that have acquired these weapons more responsible and cautious. But they may find themselves, one suspects, holding their breath in a not too distant future. In this case, neither side has the diversity of nuclear systems that would rule out all preemptive options that was considered to be so important to the stability of MAD in the US-Soviet relationship. Crisis stability may be jeopardized by uncertainties about the doctrine of the enemy or an apparent opportunity to catch the enemy by surprise, by a terrorist group getting hold of a weapon and seeking to detonate it to cause a general conflagration, or by desperation arising out of the passion and anxieties of a conventional war. So if the stabilizing effect that is held to be the most benign feature of the nuclear age somehow fails to take hold, then the risk must grow of the weapons actually being used in anger for the first time since 1945. The response of external powers to this potentially alarming situation has not been to rely on common sense and prudence by the new nuclear powers. Efforts have been made to encourage improved political relations and to educate the two sides about safe and secure command and control arrangements and the need to develop a posture that is not naturally threatening to the other side. As the 2002 crisis showed, external powers are prepared to get involved actively if they see a situation deteriorating. It may be that if both India and Pakistan accept a need for special caution in managing this relationship because of the shared fear of nuclear war, then the theory will be proven. But even when passions, but this is not an area in which to take chances. They both issued assurances, but it's hard, given what we've seen in recent years, to be totally sanguine about what is going to happen. There's no natural crisis stability here. Concerns about the vulnerability of arsenals or the risks of efforts, say, by India to take over Pakistan's nuclear assets through conventional means could force the hands of political leaders. Over time, the two sides may learn more about each other and how they're likely to act when relations are tense. But without a shared strategic culture, it is possible to imagine how elements of miscalculation may intrude into attempts at crisis management. So developing the script to avoid war does seem to me to be an important part of managing this relationship. What we don't want a situation where one side believes it has a clear idea of the other's red lines and be quite wrong. One could do similar analyses for Iran and Israel. The question of North Korea raises different issues because at stake is the future of a failed and narrowly based regime. Its only assets are its nuclear weapons, and it may be tempted, we may suspect, to use them for coercive purposes. For example, demanding, if it got really desperate, material support for its population. As for, because it fears an attempted regime change. However much those in charge of North Korea understand the outside world and whether their paranoid utterances reflect their real beliefs is hard to know. It is possible in this case to imagine a developing sense of deep and potentially terminal crisis without neighbouring countries being aware of this and the potential implications of these views. So what does all this suggest about the future of the nuclear taboo, the tradition of non-use? Nuclear weapons are now present in areas of considerable political instability. Indeed, it's precisely because key states are insecure that they've made efforts to acquire the weapons, often in the face of local and international opposition. In such circumstances, Stability cannot be a product of a particular nuclear relationship, as was achieved by the Americans and Soviets in the form of mutual assured destruction, which removed any doubt about how a war might develop. Instead, it will require addressing the complex interaction between the political, non-state as well as state, the military, irregular as well as regular, and the nuclear. The scripts are very different and very hard to think through. So my argument suggests that we may have come out of a situation which was close to the optimum nuclear world. So while there might be improvements at the margins and reductions in surplus weapons capacity, the best we could hope for would be more of the same. My fear is that it will be worse. The fact that we've managed to go for almost 68 years without a third nuclear weapon being detonated in anger is a remarkable record. But to believe that it be continued indefinitely requires remarkable confidence. But I've suggested against us three sources of restraint. The first and most important is becoming the victim of a nuclear strike, which may be reduced in circumstances when destruction may not be assured or mutual. The second was the true taboo, the social prohibition on nuclear use. But did we have to ask whether this applies to the international community as a whole, including those who operate at its edges and who may explicitly reject its core values and assumptions? Third, I suggested that it became increasingly difficult to develop compelling scripts to explain how a nuclear war could start. And this experience fed back into the search for alternative political and military options to all-out war. In many of the more pressing regional conflicts, scripts can be developed, in part because major conflicts will involve a degree of improvisation. But the basic point is these conflicts, we can't rely on prudence, taboos, or inadequate scripts to act as a source of restraint. Final point, there's a difference between equilibrium and stability. We can think of equilibrium as a point from which no party has an incentive to move, and it's something of a steady state. Stability requires more active engagement, regular adjustments and shifts to stop matters getting out of kilter. The superpower relationship was spoken of as an equilibrium, a steady state that was almost impervious to all the movement around it, reinforced by the simple reminder of the danger of any attempt to break free. The new set of conflicts may not tend to equilibrium. They can achieve stability, but that will not come from relying on prudence, taboos, or a lack of scripts. It will come from a constant and energetic effort, attending to all aspects of the key relationships. The issue isn't one of stability at small numbers, except that small numbers create a degree of ambiguity in the meaning of nuclear relationships, what may be absent when the condition is one of unequivocal and mutual assured destruction. The issue is one of stability in conditions of political volatility. Thank you.
So I always thought that the U.S. military, push comes to shove, would have gone for, if possible, a first strike, if they thought something was going to happen. And the capability was very close. If we didn't actually have it, we were near to it and couldn't achieve it. The capability of the missiles were always misrepresented. One part of our graduate program was Jack and George required the graduate students to answer a nuclear weapons question, which I think the basic, I never paid much attention to it, but I think the basic answer was a nuclear war was not possible, that you couldn't have a first strike that would be successful. But it was because the way you make the assumptions, we assumed a certain capability of hardening of the targets, but that was Russian concrete, that wasn't American concrete. We assumed that so many missiles would be available and all this other kind of stuff, which was, I think, the way scientists described the situation. But I think the U.S. military had a totally different view of it, and that they maintained it. They always wanted it, and I think they had it.
Undoubtedly, the US military had a different view. Certainly during the 50s, they pursued a different view. When there's an important qualification, when this moment came, which Carl Kazin and others were involved in, when they suddenly realized they might actually have a first strike capability in the early 60s. It was pointed out that that was true in terms of denying retaliation against the United States, but not against Europe. That is, the medium-range missile force was still quite substantial, and those who cared a little bit about Europe thought this might be important. But it was also, and this is probably was a moment when, you know, like the Robert Kennedy moment during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I now know how Tojo felt when he was planning Pearl Harbor. There was a sense that this is such a big step. We may be right, but we just can't. That last 1%, 2% is just too big a gap. And though it's true afterwards, after the mid-60s, when the Soviets really built up their arsenal, the Americans actually were probably in a stronger position than you would have gathered from a lot of the hyperbole of the time. To go to a president and say, we can do this, would have required an awful lot of confidence. And just think, you know, when Kennedy was interested in a surgical strike on Cuba, on the missiles, the reason he didn't do it is the military were incapable of doing things by halves. They wanted to check for every possibility, and so it turned into something much larger because they were quite cautious. So I don't doubt for a moment that I would say up until well into the 60s, the military were thinking in those terms.
I'm really thinking later.
I'm not sure I'm not sure that's right. I think some did. Again, you know, reading aviation, weakened space technology, all this talk, and then some of the more fanciful stuff about laser weapons and so on. You could see it, but I think the heart of that debate, I mean, that debate may have been continued at some sort of intellectual level, but it was only really believed in the 50s. And I think by the 60s, the fact is that the scientists and the rationalists in the form of McNamara were very much setting the terms of the debate. And the difficulty that Nixon, who didn't really like the conclusions found in getting out of it, illustrated just how strong those arguments were. I'm not saying they were right or wrong, but they were certainly very strong arguments. But they certainly, just a starting point, it certainly was a time when the scientists felt that they were the ones laying down how it was.
Yeah, I don't think the U.S. military ever paid attention to what the scientists thought.
Well, the policymakers did in the end. I mean, in the end, the argument was always sort of the round quip of the 50s. How many nuclear wars have you fought, General?
Mark? Thank you. So this idea of scripts is very interesting. I'm wondering if they're really completely distinct from the idea of a nuclear taboo. It seems to me something that Nina Tannenbaum might say is that, well, one of the things that happens when you have a nuclear taboo is that, you know, people's scripts start to evolve and eventually rule out the possibility of nuclear use. And so I'm wondering whether scripts that don't, you know, feature nuclear weapons or, you know, see any plausible use for nuclear weapons is itself part of the consequence of some sort of nuclear taboo. And maybe the word taboo is wrong, and maybe Tannenbaum has the story of the origins of it wrong. But it seems to me that that may still be, you know, the script may be the consequence of the taboo rather than something distinct from it.
I mean, I think the script actually is closer to the prudence issue than the taboo issue. I mean, the script is a strategy. It's another way of talking about a strategy, about a story in the future tense about how things could develop and unfold. But it's the expectations with which you enter a conflict. And if the script tells you that as soon as one nuclear weapon is used, you're into all-out conflagration, then that affects your behavior. If a script tells you that you can go 10, 15 steps and it's pretty nasty, but civilization as we know it hasn't yet been completely destroyed, that creates different expectations. Now, of course, part of all of this is assumptions about human values, patterns of behavior, how people are assumed to act. And in that sense, the script is not just sort of a heuristic, but it should be something that forces you to address issues in a strategy, whereas A taboo just says you can't do that. It's not dynamic, it's not interactive. And we know that the problem with basic problem with taboos is they may be there when you start, but as things change, then people's values change. I mean, it's always staggering when you look, just what's happened to Syria, and the breakdown of social relationships and just what happened, sort of behaviour that people are surprised themselves by what they engage in because circumstances have changed. You still have a script at this point. It's just a different script. So that's a continual thing. The point is that the more the scripts in one situation move you away from thinking about it being possible to nuclear use, they reinforce the restraint. What I'm saying is in circumstances of high political volatility, they're likely to shift very quickly, and you may find yourself in situations where you start to see a point. It's whether there's a strategic use, I suppose, is the question.
Brian?
I guess on this point, I'm trying to figure out whether scripts at the end of the day are really the stabilizing force, whether they're these opportunities for strategic surprise. Because I thought I heard you say something to the effect of the U.S. use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was actually breaking from the script of this escalation of strategic bombing that led it to have some sort of use. So at the end of the day, why do scripts matter one way or the other? They're either stabilizing, they reinforce restraint, or they're these sort of opportunities to blow them out of the water, and we'll see as a result of breaking them the first use of nuclear weapons.
Yeah, I mean, the point about the script is that it became harder over time to imagine how you would start a nuclear war. The processes that would lead even to a decision to first use, never mind what would happen afterwards. So hard as people could try, they couldn't get one started. And that's a particular point. The general question of scripts is, going back to the social psychology of them, is that we carry in our heads a recognition of certain circumstances that leads us to expect a certain sequence of events. And that if something happens which is unexpected or doesn't fit, then we have to be able to adjust and adapt. And the point about the shock of Hiroshima on the Japanese was that those who'd argued for carrying on with the war were lost for words. They didn't have, all of a sudden, they didn't have good arguments. They tried to minimize it or something, but it just didn't work for them. So their script was completely demolished, if you like, by the bombs coming along. So I think I'm using it in two different ways, and I accept that may be confusing. I'm using it both in terms of a general explanation of strategy and how it works, and a specific explanation of why strategic debate took on the particular character it did with regard to nuclear weapons, because it became increasingly hard to think of ways in planning, preparation, how you would actually start a nuclear war. So all the scenarios and the war games, suddenly, you were faced with dire choices, but you really weren't quite sure how you'd got there.
Well, I mean, it seems from the way you're using this concept, at least when I first heard you start with it, that it's a kind of a familiar map of the terrain that you're getting ready to traverse, right? So statesmen who are thinking about conventional war have familiar maps of the terrain. They have cause-effect knowledge that seems plausible. It seems based on experience, right? And even your discussion of how the Americans came to nuclear use talks about an incremental change in expectations and understandings about how war could go, that started with the idea that, well, maybe you could have precision strategic bombing, or maybe this horror could happen. But statesmen really didn't entertain it as a practical matter. A handful of theorists did. And then it was all made real in World War II. And then as you get up to the point where you have these nuclear weapons, you're gluing them onto a very, very familiar activity, which is to say you've already burnt down the centers of the 80 or 70 largest cities in Japan. You've already gotten there, right? So it just seems like the next step, right? But when I heard you make the shift to the Cold War, I thought I was hearing you say that while the likes of Herbert York or Albert Wohlstetter could try and invent a map of this terrain that would somehow seem familiar, they couldn't credibly do it. So even, I credit Harvey's account that our side and the other side continued, I think, right up to the end to figure out ways to get the better of the other in the event of a war. The story that they could tell was not that compelling, not just to single statesmen, but to the communities. The communities had this in reserve. Maybe it's a place you want to go. But when the story was told, okay, we're going up to the edge and we're going to go over the edge because we have the map, we have the cause-effect analysis, we know the way this is going to go, it was just inherently implausible. That's where I thought, is that understandable?
You put it better than I did. Yeah, no, it's fine. I mean, every president, when they were inducted into the SIOP, into the Single Integrated Operations Plan, were always amazed by how few options they seemed to have. I mean, the point that Schlesinger made in the early 70s and was made again in the late 70s and the early 80s, despite all this talk about flexible options and so on, they don't exist. They weren't really there because it proved very hard actually in practice to development to make sure the command and control would work. If you actually went into the technicalities, it all started to fall down. And that drained plausibility from this. So of course, that was their job. They tried to work it out. And look at the Soviet stuff, and it seemed to be expressing great confidence that they could, and even some quite scary planning about how they would cope. But you then have to, could you ever make this plausible or credible? You can't say that some, given that Brezhnev was pretty drunk when he took the decision to go into Afghanistan, if he'd been drunk enough, maybe he'd accepted it. But it would be otherwise it would have been a pretty hard sell.
Dan Altman?
Yeah, so if we accept that the sort of most difficult problem confronting U.S. nuclear strategy during the Cold War was this issue of how do we credibly threaten to start a nuclear war for Western Europe in response to a conventional invasion. My question is what do you actually think would have happened if the Red Army does cross the border and start marching on the Pyrenees, defeats the resistance at the front in West Germany and is moving? What actually would have happened?
An easy question. I've got no idea. I mean, to be honest, there would have been panic, basically. Been panic all the way through the system. I don't think nuclear weapons would have been used. Every senior policymaker who's talked about that decision in private, with possibly the only exception of Carter, I think, seems to suggest that they would have said no. I mean, we're not going to accept the destruction of Chicago or New York or whatever in this situation. My view is that the real deterrent was not nuclear weapons but alliance. The key to deterrence was alliance, because without alliance, nuclear deterrence made no sense anyway, because the United States certainly wasn't going to go to war on behalf of countries that weren't allies. The origins of NATO were the judgment that if Hitler or the Kaiser had known that they'd eventually be fighting the Americans, they wouldn't have bothered, because they'd have seen what was going to happen. So it was, alliance was the key to deterrence. I still think that's still my view. Alliance is the key to deterrence. Clearly, with a big enough shock, the alliance would have broken down, possibly. So, when you've got into that situation, then you're in real trouble. Of course, you're assuming that the Hungarians and the Czechs and the Poles and so on are all doing as they're told. And think this is a great idea too. So, as my point about scriptures, you've still got to beg an awful lot of questions to have got to that point. But I think the best evidence is that people would have panicked, and it would have been a very hard. An American administration might have made threatening noises, but if they weren't working, it would have been very hard for them to launch a first strike. The risk would, of course, been, and if you look at the Soviet Warsaw Pact planning, this is where If they assumed that the risks were growing, they would have launched attacks, probably first in Europe. So there could well have been nuclear use, but it would have been in Europe, not necessarily involving directly the territory of the United States. Thankfully, we've passed that period.
Eric?
In this question of scripts, it's an educational institution. I want to bring up education. Would the script now used between us and the Soviet Union, it seemed to me it took the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so if I think about India and Pakistan and something like that, they haven't had this. I don't know if cargo is sufficient. And so I'm asking your judgment. What is the role of education here in making a script that will stop a possible nuclear?
I think the learning experience is important, and of course, Berlin, I would say Berlin and Cuba together had a salutary effect on both sides, and they saw how one thing could lead to another. Now, that's not unusual. I mean, when two sides go to the brink and they look down and draw back, they realize that these decisions aren't always as easy as they think. I mean, this is how you try to run your economy now. So it's not. I mean, crises make people think differently, or sometimes they don't. I think the learning experiences, the education question is whether the experiences of others can be transmitted to these leaders to say, just think this through. Here's comparable situations and here's how people reacted. And attempts have been made to do that. How much it gets through, who knows? I think real experience is still more important, your own experiences. And of course, you know, even with our own countries, you know, what we think about war, what we remember of war is very different to how our fathers and grandfathers thought about war, and what we know of crisis. We've been through some situations, and you know, you can apply this to all sorts of things. A generation that knew the Depression would take current economic circumstances, look at them differently to a generation that has known a bit of boom and bust. Generations make a difference in that sense. So I think there are some real issues there. But you know, all you can do is try.
Well, I know that Larry, Sir Lawrence Freedman, has an early flight tomorrow and another talk to give, and he's still dealing with London time, so I think we should thank him for his contributions this evening and wish him well in his travels tomorrow.
Thank you very much.